according to the International Monetary Fund. Inflation in Venezuela accumulated of 387% in 2025. 35% unemployment rate, debt to GDP ratio of 308%. 8 million people left the country. One of the biggest economic crises in modern history. But there is one detail that makes all of this even more shocking. Venezuela was once one of the richest countries in Latin America, and not just a little rich. In the late 1950s, Venezuela's real GDP per capita almost reached that of Ireland or West Germany. Think about that for a second. A Latin American country, economically comparable to Western Europe, that was Venezuela. Between the 1950s and 1970s, Caracas was a symbol of luxury and flashiness. The Venezuelan currency, the bolivar, was strong. Consumption was booming. The country was getting rich rapidly through oil. Despite this, inequality was already enormous. While the elite lived with a high standard of living, most of the population remained in poverty. And that is exactly where one of Venezuela's biggest problems began. The country transformed itself into a petrostate. In other words, an economy extremely dependent on oil. Venezuela has the largest oil reserves in the world. According to OPEC, proven oil resources stood at 303 billion barrels as of 2023. That is more than Saudi Arabia, more than Iraq, more than Iran. Venezuela sits on the largest underground treasure of black gold ever recorded by humanity. And yet, it imports gasoline. Let that sink in. As oil money flowed in, the economy became less and less diversified. Agriculture was gradually abandoned. Industry lost base. The agricultural sector today represents only 5% of Venezuela's GDP, a country with fertile land and tropical climate. Unable to feed itself, oil started controlling the country's economic direction. And whoever controlled the oil controlled the country. It wasn't just a resource. It was power. It was politics. It was everything. But then came the 1980s, and oil prices collapsed on the international market. This happened because there was a global oil oversupply, economic slowdown in several countries, and increased production in other regions of the world. The impact on Venezuela was devastating. Public debt skyrocketed, inflation increased, unemployment grew, and the government of Carlos Andrés Pérez, until then social democratic, lost the ability to sustain the subsidies and programs it had promised. In addition, as the currency lost value, importing products became much more expensive. And remember, Venezuela was already highly dependent on imported goods. Then came the social collapse. On February 27, 1989, the so-called Caracazo took place, a massive social explosion in the streets of Caracas against economic measures imposed by the government of Carlos Andrés Pérez, who went from being social democratic to being seen as very economically liberal with a fiscal austerity policy. An elected president, but accused of corruption and deeply unpopular. The protests quickly spiraled out of control, and the army responded with extreme violence. Nearly 300 people died due to the repression, but the official numbers were contested by human rights organizations who estimated the real death toll could be much higher. The Caracazo became a wound in Venezuela's national memory, a turning point, a before and after. And it is precisely in this environment of revolt, economic crisis, and political distrust that Hugo Chavez emerges, a lieutenant colonel in the Venezuelan army. In 1992, Chavez attempts a coup d'etat to overthrow Carlos Andrés Pérez. The coup fails. Chavez is arrested. But here is where history takes a fascinating turn. From prison, Chavez appears on national television. He takes full responsibility. He says famously, "For now, the objectives were not achieved." Those two words, "for now," the Venezuelan people heard a message of defiance, not defeat, and that made him a symbol. During his imprisonment, he begins gaining popular support precisely because he presents himself as someone who is against the system. In 1994, President Rafael Caldera under the justification of pacifying the country, dismisses the case and Chavez is released. For years later, something happens that would completely change Venezuela's history. In 1998, Hugo Chavez is elected president with 56% of the vote. He ran on a promise to end corruption, distribute oil wealth, and rebuild Venezuela for the poor. And millions believe him. And then something fundamental happens. Oil prices soar in the 2000s. This gives Chavez's government a gigantic amount of money. With this revenue, Chavez expands social programs, distributes food, increases subsidies for consumer goods, builds hospitals in poor neighborhoods, launches literacy campaigns. Between 2003 and 2012, poverty rates fell significantly. Millions of Venezuelans were lifted out of extreme poverty. These were real, tangible improvements in people's lives, and they were funded entirely by one thing: oil. At the same time, he increases control over companies and over the market. The government also demands that the state oil company PDVSA transfer more and more resources directly to the state. At the time, PDVSA was one of the most important oil companies in the world. During the 1990s and early 2000s, it produced more than 3 million barrels per day, had highly qualified engineers, and Venezuela was among the largest oil producers on the planet. But in 2002 and 2003, Chavez's opponents organized a massive strike at the company in an attempt to force new election. The strike paralyzes part of oil production. The government responds by increasing even more control over the company and over the economy. Many technicians and engineers leave the state company. Thousands of skilled professionals who had spent decades building PDVSA's expertise were fired, pushed out, or forced to leave. And little by little, PDVSA's technical capacity begins to deteriorate. But while oil remained expensive, the problems were still hidden. The money kept flowing. The subsidies kept coming. The cracks were forming underground, invisible to most. Then, in 2013, Hugo Chavez dies of cancer. Nicolas Maduro takes power, and almost immediately, the tide turns. And then comes 2014, the first full year of Nicolas Maduro's government. Oil prices fall by around 50%, and that is when the fragility of the Venezuelan economy appears in a brutal way. Without oil dollars, practically everything became scarce. Food, medicine, industrialized products. Inflation completely spiraled out of control. 68% in 2014, 180% in 2015, and it kept growing to such extreme levels that the currency practically lost its function. In 2018, the IMF estimated inflation at around 1,370,000%. To give you some perspective, if a bag of rice cost 1 bolivar in January 2018, by December the same year, that same bag of rice cost 13,700 bolivares. Salaries became worthless within days of being paid. People were using banknotes as paper for crafts because the paper itself was worth more than the money printed on it. The government responded not by reforming the economy, but by printing more money. The money supply was regularly expanded by 20 to 30% per month, which only made inflation accelerate even faster. A vicious cycle with no floor. GDP fell by over 75% between 2014 and 2021. Venezuela lost 75% of its GDP. Economists have called it the largest economic contraction outside of armed conflicts in modern history. At the same time, political repression intensified, international sanctions worsened, and millions of Venezuelans began leaving the country. The sanctions, led by the United States, targeted PDVSA directly. According to Tricontinental, an institute for social research in the Global South, between 2017 and 2024, Venezuela lost an estimated $226 billion in oil revenues due to these measures. That is roughly $77 million every single day. Today, more than 8 million people have emigrated from Venezuela. More than 6 million went to other Latin American countries. Others went to the United States and Spain. To put that number in context, that is roughly 1 in every 4 Venezuelans. One of the largest displacement crises in the history of the Western Hemisphere, surpassing in relative terms some of the great refugee crises of the 20th century. Meanwhile, PDVSA itself collapsed. Without investment, with corruption, brain drain, and under sanctions, production plummeted. Venezuela went from producing more than 3 million barrels per day in the 1990s to a devastating low of just 337,000 barrels per day in June of 2020. By 2023, it had partially recovered to around 850,000 barrels, still only a fraction of what it once was. And paradoxically, the country with the largest oil reserves in the world is importing gasoline because its refineries have crumbled, because the engineers left, because political loyalty replaced technical expertise. Venezuela is a proof of how extremely risky it is to depend on a single commodity. Since all power in the country started revolving around oil, military officials began occupying high positions inside PDVSA. Politicians started seeing it as their highest priority, and economic power itself started viewing it as its only opportunity. Economists call the phenomenon the resource curse, or Dutch disease, a pattern seen across the world. Countries that discover enormous natural wealth often end up poorer, more unequal, and more unstable than countries with no resources at all. The reason? When one sector generates all the money, everything else dies. Agriculture, manufacturing, technology, services, none of them can compete with oil revenue. So they are abandoned, and when the oil price falls, as it always eventually does, there is nothing left to fall back on. Norway found oil too. In fact, Norway has been one of the world's largest oil producers for decades, but Norway built sovereign wealth funds. Norway invested in education, in technology, in institutions. Today, in 2024, the oil sector accounts for about 20% of Norway's GDP. The rest of the economy stands on its own. Venezuela never built that foundation. It built dependency. And dependency, when the tide goes out, leaves you with nothing. What happened in Venezuela is not just an economic story. It is a warning about corruption, about the danger of concentrating power in a single resource, about what happens when a government mistakes luck for strategy. The Bolivar, once a strong and respected currency, is today worth almost nothing. A country that once welcomed immigrants from Europe and the United States is now one that exports its own people to those same places. And the saddest part? The oil is still there, 303 billion barrels, sitting underground, while the people above them struggle to find food. Its oil is primarily extra heavy and sour, high sulfur, often described as tar-like. It is difficult and costly to extract, transport, and refine, resulting in lower market prices. Despite being low quality, it is highly prized by specific U.S. Gulf Coast refineries designed to process heavy crude. Venezuela did not fail because it lacked resources. Venezuela failed because it lacked something far more valuable: institutions, diversification, and the political will to build a future beyond oil. That is the